Chapter 45. Accepting the Invitation.
Starlight Glimmer. I was here to help, even if I didn't do a very good job.
Twilight had gotten very used to Spike saying those words over the next 20 minutes or so. In that time, she had relived the painful discussion with Spike 3 more times. Each time the irritating phrase passed through his lips, all progress was lost on the front of making him aware that his memories were being blocked. Whatever spell had been used on Spike, as well as on Nox and who knew how many other ponies around town, was as clever as it was blunt. Part of its design seemed to be dedicated to keeping the victim entirely unaware of whatever memories the spell was meant to block, as well as keeping them from even knowing about the lock on their memories in the first place. Though, Twilight had managed to deduce that she could make Spike aware of the spell without it kicking in, as the enchantment only reset after the temporary return of the blocked-out memories. Thus, Twilight was able to at least have Spike aware of the situation, and how one of her primary objectives was to have the spell lifted. Explaining these things didn't get any easier with repetition, but at least she was good enough to keep Spike from panicking every time. A small benefit. Though figuring out that little loophole in Starlight's magic wasn't the only thing this repetition had taught Twilight. Just as she had intended, she used the temporary lapses in the spell to piece together a clearer picture of what had happened on the night Starlight and Spike met one another. It only took her 2 of the 3 iterations to learn what she needed of that night. With this knowledge, she'd be able to gauge just how trustworthy Starlight Glimmer was. If she undid the spell and Spike was able to tell the same story he had told Twilight 3 times already, there might be some merit in listening to what she had to say. If she refused, or if the story came out different, or if she tried anything else that was sketchy, then Twilight would have a very good reason to teach that unicorn why it was a very bad idea to mess with her son. With all of that out of the way, the time to meet back up with Rainbow Dash had come. Twilight claimed her bags and they went on their way. The Pegasus was found waiting for the 2 just outside the home, having decided to remain while she waited for Twilight and Spike to finish. As soon as they emerged, Dash was quick to ask if Twilight had gotten what she needed. And while Twilight was able to give her answer, she wasn't given much of a chance to elaborate on what she had learned before Dash proclaimed it was time they got moving and began to trek towards Golden Oaks, which gave Twilight and Spike no choice but to follow.
So, who was at the door?
Twilight asked as they walked through Ponyville, ignoring the murmurs and glances from the various citizens going about. It was an inconvenience to be dealt with later.
Oh, it was just Pinky.
Dash's answer came with an air of distraction. Clearly, she wasn't focused on that right now.
She heard you got out of the slammer, so she came by to check on you. What did you tell her? That you were busy? Is that it? Well, it only took me 15 minutes longer than it should have, because, Pinky, but yeah, that's it.
Rainbow let out a loud yawn before suddenly perking up as she recalled an important detail.
And she wants you to talk to Rarity at some point. I told her I'd tell you. Of course she wants us to talk.
Twilight sighed inwardly as the conversation was dropped, left behind as they continued towards the library. Thankfully, the Golden Oaks library wasn't far, and it wasn't long before they arrived. It stood as it always did on the outskirts of town, entirely untouched by the scandal surrounding it. The only hint that anything was amiss was a simple close sign hanging on the door, the only thing keeping the masses from entering the crime scene. There were no barricades, no guards, nothing to even suggest that something serious was going on. To an outside observer, it was just a closed library. Nothing more.
Okay. Red flag number 1.
Rainbow Dash made her concerns known, glancing around with skeptical eyes.
I know I told some guards to cover this place. Maybe they're on break?
There was a nervous optimism to Spike's question, as he joined in the search by peering around as well.
Or maybe they just conveniently forgot why they were here.
Twilight's insinuation wasn't lost on anyone present. Spike gave a nervous gulp, and a wayward claw found its way to the side of his head. With the possibility in mind, Twilight strode over to the door and placed a hoof on the handle, opening it just like she would on any other day. Not a sliver of magic was used in the attempt, and the door creaked open without even a struggle. Though it wasn't as unfortified as one might think. As the wooden barrier was pushed out of the way, it passed through a thin tether of blue light. It only lasted a second before the door snapped the line in twain, and he erased the arcane effect from existence with a flicker, easily standing out in the darkness of the interior. Twilight instantly recognized the crude, yet effective security measure for what it was, a silent alarm. Many unicorns would learn how to use such spells from a very early age, especially the paranoid sort who didn't like the idea of their siblings, or parents, heavens forbid, going into their bedrooms without permission, something that Twilight herself was guilty of before her days at the Queen's Academy.
Red flag too. She left a magic tripwire.
Twilight pushed the door all the way open, glaring into the dim library with a sense of single-minded determination.
She knows we're here.
Rainbow snickered.
Guess she's not a fan of being ambushed. I thought we were here to talk to her.
Spike asked as he followed the two mares into the building.
Why would we?
His question would likely never be answered, thanks to a loud flash of magical light towards the back of the room, catching them off guard and putting them on high alert. Starlight Glimmer haphazardly stumbled out of her own teleportation spell, still adorned by the overstuffed saddlebags and the silver watch that had become synonymous with her appearance. Her momentum didn't halt, and she ended up ramming into a bookshelf with a painful sounding. A small cascade of loose books added insult to injury, with a few extra knocks on her noggin.
Note to self: don't mix alarms with teleport spells. Ow.
Starlight murmured to herself as she righted her balance and collected her bearings, straightening out her mane and clearing her throat. Then, with an overly dramatic flip of her hair, she turned to face her three guests as if she hadn't just entered like a complete buffoon.
Hello, Twilight. I'm glad you got my... Oh, good. You brought Rainbow Dash.
The mare's demeanor switched from cool and collected to pleasantly surprised once she caught sight of the Pegasus.
I actually needed to talk to her, too, so that saves us, time.
Her sentence trailed off as her eyes landed on Spike. She looked on him with the kind of expression one might have to an oncoming train suddenly appearing in their bedroom. A potent cocktail of surprise and fear that left Starlight's jaw hanging slack. Before anyone could question her reaction, she raised a hoof to point at Spike as her eyes darted back to Twilight.
What's he doing here?
Now, Twilight was already upset enough over the things this unicorn was doing. But after that spontaneous appearance and her reaction, she couldn't help but punctuate her sentence with a long, sharp inhale.
What's wrong? Did you wipe your own memory, too?
The sarcasm was as subtle as a brick to the face, and no one missed it. Starlight almost looked like she was having some kind of panic attack. Her eyes darted back and forth as she processed the question, and likely several more that were raging behind her eyes. But in a moment of realization, her eyes closed, and she hung her head shamefully. Very calmly, she answered Twilight's sarcastic quip with a query of her own.
He freaks out if he hears someone say my name, doesn't he? That's one way of putting it.
Twilight bitterly confirmed.
Would you like to explain why that is?
Falling to her haunches, Starlight buried her face in her foreheads and sighed.
Oh, I panicked and used the wrong spell. Did you say the wrong spell?
Under any other circumstance, that would have sent Twilight into a wrathful rage. But she didn't do anything to make her wrath known for now. She kept her voice calm and her horn dark. Screaming and violence weren't going to get them anywhere here, especially since Starlight was the one who called this little meeting. She had been the one who wanted to talk, so Twilight figured she would at least hear her out. She didn't have patience for much else, though.
What do you mean, wrong spell? Hold on. How do you use the wrong spell?
It was now that Rainbow chose to interject herself into the conversation.
Now, I'm not an expert on magic, but I feel like that's a pretty stupid mistake to make. Well, stupid mistakes are pretty easy to make when you're sleep-deprived and having continuous panic attacks.
Starlight answered without a moment of hesitation. She lifted her head, and a pair of tired-looking eyes were aimed at the noisy Pegasus.
It's been a very busy week for me. Sue me. Oh, you're going to wish I took you to court if you don't start giving me some answers.
Twilight's threat was delivered by a tone befitting her anger.
For starters, what was the right spell to use on my son? A memory spell that actually works right?
Starlight slowly stood back up, her head lowered as if she were ashamed of what she had done. She was quiet for a moment longer before taking a deep breath and turning her eyes back to the enraged alicorn.
My intention was to keep that incident as my little secret. I didn't need you getting sidetracked with a million questions about me, but I guess my efforts there were in vain. It was inevitable, really.
With the way that Starlight was carrying herself, she knew she had been caught with her hoof in the cookie jar and was making no attempts to hide it. Even now, Twilight could tell that there was sincerity in her words. Though as sincere as she may have been, it didn't change the fact that Starlight had basically put a curse on Spike. And that was still enough to set Twilight's scalp tingling with fury.
But now that that's out of the way,
Starlight continued with some semblance of confidence,
we have a lot to talk about and not a whole lot of time, so we undo the spell you put on him first.
Twilight interrupted.
I'm not listening to another word you say until I hear what he has to say about you.
Starlight was clearly caught by surprise, judging by the look on her face. But Twilight wouldn't budge, and there wasn't a single attempt by anyone present to try and make her. Starlight least of all. She walked over to the nearby desk and deposited her saddlebags, searching through them with careful haste.
Tell you what, as a show of good faith, I'll do you one better,
she explained as she withdrew one of the many books from within her pack. She flipped through the pages quickly while also returning the bags to her back. Once she found what she was looking for, she turned back to Twilight and levitated the open book towards her.
Here, this should be capable of undoing any of the spells in the Disciples' playbook, including the one I used on him.
A twinge of shame returned to her voice as she spoke that last part. Twilight looked down to the page and skimmed it over. It was definitely homebrewed, something custom-made to serve the purpose that Starlight claimed it to have. And to Starlight's credit, Twilight couldn't see anything wrong with it. The different components came together in a way that seemed to only react to other magical effects and then cancel them out. Unless the alicorn was misreading something, which was highly unlikely, the spell was literally incapable of causing harm to any living creature. So if nothing else, it was safe. With that in mind, Twilight offered the unicorn another cautious glance before heading back for Spike. He had spent the majority of the conversation in confused silence, probably trying to piece together what was going on from what little information he had. He at least knew what Twilight was hoping to accomplish, so he didn't ask any questions when he noticed her drawing close. Neither of them was really ready for what was about to be attempted, but they couldn't just leave it alone at this point. Before casting the spell, Twilight gave one last stern glare to Starlight, a silent warning of what was to come if this didn't work as promised. Starlight simply stood there in silence, waiting for Twilight to do her work. In an attempt to regain some focus, Rainbow made herself known through a quick clearing of her throat.
So you were saying something about needing to talk to me? Care to explain a bit of that?
Flinching as if knocked out of a hypnotic trance, Starlight turned towards her.
Of course.
Starlight stopped listening to them as they started their own discussion, focusing instead on Spike. After taking the time to make sure he was ready for what was about to happen, she lit her horn and cast a spell. A series of dancing lights slowly fell from her horn to flutter around Spike's head. His eyes went wide and his pupils dilated, as if he were compelled to focus on them in a mindless haze. Twilight felt a surge of worry, but it was probably a side effect that was quick to pass. Once the lights faded, Spike's eyes returned to normal, and Twilight gave him a few moments to get his bearings.
Spike? Do you feel all right?
Spike groaned, still woozy from the spell as the magic worked its way out of his system.
I think so. Oh, why does everything taste like sand? It's probably just a side effect of the spell I used.
The confusion on his face only intensified from there, but something in his head clicked into place, and his expression began to wane.
Right. You used a spell to undo another spell. Ugh.
His eyes closed as he rubbed a claw over his forehead. If Twilight didn't know any better, she would say that Spike was experiencing his first hangover.
Oh, was it supposed to make me feel like my head is swimming? We're dealing with mind-altering magic, so it's not exactly unexpected. Just stay calm and breathe. It should clear up soon.
Twilight spoke with confidence, but in truth, there was at least some anxiety floating around in her head. Any mother would be a bit anxious about using an unknown spell on their child.
Let me know if it gets worse.
It's okay, I think it's starting to clear up. Spike grumbled one last time, before shaking off the last of the delirium. He sighed with relief and opened his eyes.
Okay, I think I'm good. All right then. Does the name Starlight Glimmer sound familiar? Yeah, she was in our house the other night.
He spoke in a shockingly casual tone given the subject. It only took him a split second to realize what he had just said, and his eyes lit up with shock.
Oh, she was in our house! How did I forget? Because she made you forget, remember? Oh, right.
Spike sunk back into himself as he pondered over his freshly freed memories.
Yeah, I remember now. Would you care to explain what happened? Yeah, I'll do that.
Spike slowly nodded in response, taking a second to overlook his memories just so he wouldn't miss anything.
I remember waking up in the middle of the night. I heard something, and my first thought was to go get you.
Twilight nodded approvingly. That had been the right course of action in the moment.
That's when I heard her talking.
He paused for a moment to peer around Twilight and get a good look at Starlight from across the room. Twilight followed his gaze. Whatever conversation Rainbow and Starlight were having, it caught Starlight's full attention, preventing her from eavesdropping on Spike and Twilight's discourse.
She was saying some really weird stuff, too. Stuff like what? Something about a note she left, and then she went on about how you apparently did something without a plan? Something about you being smarter than that? I didn't really understand.
While Spike didn't understand, it confirmed for Twilight that the answers in the Everfree note had been left by Starlight. Though the comment on Twilight's intelligence was a minor surprise, it at least served as proof that Starlight had known about them ahead of time. But Twilight didn't need to worry about that right now. She nodded.
Okay, what happened next? After that, she started talking down about herself. She said she should have expected you to go and look at the big, ominous, glowing thing in the woods. I don't really know what she meant by that, but that's about when she noticed me.
Spike shuddered as he recalled how he'd been caught so easily.
But she didn't freak out like most ponies normally do. She was actually really calm about me being there. Like she already knew about me.
Again, this wasn't a surprise, considering that she had heard the vague variation of this story earlier. It didn't stop her from wondering how Starlight could have known about Spike ahead of time, but she would keep those questions to herself for now.
She said that she wasn't there to cause trouble. You were asleep, and she said she was helping you get into bed, that you didn't want to wake up in the woods.
Spike stopped himself as he mused over his memories. After a few seconds, he looked to Twilight with a great deal of curiosity.
Did you go into the woods in the middle of the night? Yes. Why? She left me a note, telling me there would be answers in the woods. I got a little too curious for my own good.
The simple truth flowed out of her like tap water. After everything that had happened between them in the past few days, Twilight wouldn't consider lying to Spike now.
It, may have ended with me getting knocked out by a magical glowing rock.
Spike's head tilted at the absurdity of the explanation.
We can talk more about that later. Could you keep going? This is important.
Spike narrowed his eyes slightly at that, tucking that bit of info away for later before continuing with his story.
Well, anyway, after she noticed me, she said she wasn't there to cause trouble. She was putting you in bed after you knocked yourself out in the woods.
A great emphasis was placed on that bit, making Twilight feel just a touch guilty.
And that you'd be fine in the morning. Did you say or do anything to try and hurt you?
Spike shook his head.
Nope. She even said I'd probably never see her again if her plans went right.
Once again, he peered around Twilight to the other conversation in the room.
I guess her plan didn't go right. And that's when she wiped your memory? Yeah.
Uncertainty made itself known on Spike's face.
Wait, no. There was one more thing. She told me to take care of you for her. And then she wiped my memory.
At least the story Spike just told matched up with the one she had heard earlier. Of course, there were still plenty of questions to be had about Starlight, and how she had managed to show up at every turn, and Spike's story still didn't provide any answers on any of these fronts. Starlight was still an enigma, a conundrum that Twilight couldn't help but try to unravel in her mind.
It really does sound like she knows us,
Twilight murmured under her breath, rubbing the side of her chin as she wondered.
The question is, how? Maybe we met her before? While we were traveling? That's the only way any of this makes sense. But then she would have had to wipe her memories. And why would she do that? It would just make her job harder, whatever her job is. Well, she called you here to talk, right? Why not just ask her?
Spike offered another glance towards Starlight, narrowing his eyes.
She wouldn't have done that if she didn't want to explain anything, right?
An excellent point, one that Twilight agreed to with a nod. Rising back to her full height, her attention shifted back to Starlight and Rainbow Dash. Whatever discussion they were having had ended while Twilight and Spike were busy, the two mares now busy digging through their saddlebags. Moving cautiously to keep Starlight from noticing, Twilight made her way to Rainbow Dash.
So what did I miss?
She whispered to Rainbow. her eyes locked firmly on Starlight on the other end of the room.
Glim Glam and I came to a little agreement,
Rainbow explained, significantly less subtly, an act that momentarily drew Starlight's notice. Her attention only lasted for a second before she went back to digging through her things.
How did things go on your end? Get the little guy's head unscrambled? Yeah, I did.
Twilight was admittedly still distracted by Starlight, watching her as if waiting for something to happen. Nothing ever did, though. Starlight just kept fumbling through her bags, which only served to make Twilight even more anxious.
The story he gave me matched what I got out of him earlier, so if nothing else, she gave me the right spell. What did you get out of her? Not much. She said her info's on a need-to-know basis. Just needed me for that dusty old book you found.
Dash gave a grin as she pulled out the very item she was looking for, the well-worn blue book bearing the choir's Ciaran name. Twilight was appalled.
And you're just going to give it to her? Nope. She wants me to give it to you.
With a resounding plop, the book was hastily tossed down at Twilight's hooves.
Oh, and you're probably gonna need these if she expects you to read it.
Just as quickly as Dash threw the book to the ground, she whipped a wing at Twilight's face. Twilight let out a shrill yelp and stumbled back from the scion wing being unexpectedly thrust into her face, and the feathers tickled at her nose unexpectedly, and some of them even managed to get into her mouth and tickle at her tongue with an unpleasant flavor of feathers. Overall, it wasn't a fun time.
What was that about?
Twilight gagged and hacked to get the awfully bland taste out of her mouth before glaring at Rainbow, who was now snickering like a child from her own antics.
That's a good look for you, Egghead.
Dash grinned like a madman and chuckled again.
You should wear glasses more often.
There was a moment of confusion from Twilight before she reached up to touch her face with a hoof. Sure enough, a pair of glasses that hadn't been there before were now sitting squarely on her face. Dash was the only possible culprit, but that didn't stop her from asking questions.
What are these for? Old black hoof trick. Lets you read basically anything. Like that book, for example.
Twilight levitated the thickly framed glasses off of her face and examined them. At a moment's glance, they looked like nothing more than an ordinary pair of glasses, but it only took a moment for her to notice a series of sigils carved along the frame. There was a surprising amount of complexity to these glyphs, considering how small they were. These were clearly made by a master of the magical arts. Looking back up to Dash as if to check she was serious or not, Twilight folded the spectacles up and gently tucked them into her saddlebags alongside the old book. There are more important things to deal with. Dash offered Twilight an approving nod before turning to Starlight Glimmer, and the smile on her face soured.
A trick that you somehow knew about. I'm guessing you're not going to elaborate? No, I'm not. You could say my special talent is knowing things I shouldn't.
Starlight's answer was as unhelpful as it was disinterested, her focus centered on finding her half of the agreed-upon trade. Once she did, however, Twilight had to fight the urge to gasp as a familiar-looking wooden box was freed from the bag.
I think I've proved that well enough by now.
She delivered the box to Rainbow Dash's hoof with a wisp of blue magic, and Twilight could only wince as Rainbow lifted the lid to look inside. She instinctively craned her head back, making absolutely sure she didn't make eye contact with the mysterious stone in fear of another sudden onset case of magically induced narcolepsy. She sighed with relief when the lid was shut again without a repeat of that incident. With Rainbow Dash seemingly satisfied with her acquisition, Twilight was free to steel her resolve once more and finally start asking this mare some questions.
Why did you have that?
Twilight's question was stern and cold.
Why didn't either of you grab it the last time you were here?
Starlight spoke back in the same defeated tone that she'd been carrying for most of this conversation.
I figured you would have at least realized how important it is, considering how it should have reacted to your travel amulet.
Once again caught off guard, Twilight could only stare with blank perplexion at the unicorn. Her memory of the events that had led to her second dreamwalking session were hazy, at best, but she remembered clearly enough that distinctive ringing sound that began emanating from her bag when it was happening. A ring that she had heard before in the Everfree Forest, the first time she'd been made to dream against her will. And the fact that Starlight somehow knew about that specific detail, among everything else, was harrowing in and of itself. Just how closely was Twilight being watched?
She even knows about that?
Spike asked, matching his mother's current state of anxiety.
Why does she know about that? Yeah, why do you know about that?
Twilight almost growled, slowly closing the gap between her and Starlight.
You brought me here to talk, so start talking.
A long pause fell over the space, Starlight gazing off in an almost longing fashion at Twilight. Twilight couldn't quite put a pin on what it was going through this pony's head, but as she looked into her eyes, she saw something she didn't expect. Pain. There was a pain in Starlight's eyes that she was very clearly trying to hold back.
Gladly. But like Agent Dash said, the things I have to say are for your ears only.
Starlight took a step forward and held an upturned hoof toward Twilight.
I need you to come with me. There's a lot we need to do, and we don't have a lot of time to do it. Less than 12 hours if she wasn't lying,
Dash added, caught somewhere between her normal confidence and a sense of legitimate concern.
I tried to get more out of her while you were busy, but she wouldn't budge. She's just as stubborn as you are, if not more.
Spike gulped, caught up on the time limit that had just been established.
12 hours until what? The end of the world,
Starlight answered without a moment of hesitation.
That's why we need to go now, Twilight.
Twilight practically recoiled from the casual way the stakes had been laid out, and donned an expression of bewilderment as she glared at Starlight.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? The end of the world?
Dash obliged in Starlight's place.
Did you stutter? I told you this was big. Well, no, but I feel like you should at least explain it a little better. You'd know what was at stake by now already. If I hadn't screwed everything up.
Starlight mumbled shamefully under her breath, just barely loud enough to be heard. She cleared her throat and reasserted her more collected tone.
To make a long story short, the choir has plans for our world, and they have almost everything they need to carry them out. Which is why you and I need to go now. I can explain more on the way. And you're okay with all of this?
Twilight turned to Rainbow Dash in disbelief.
Me going on ahead to get all the answers with her? Not really. But given your current situation, I trust that you won't be keeping too many secrets from me.
Dash's reasoning was blunt, but it didn't come with any hint of malice. The Pegasus was just stating the facts.
Besides, Glim did give me something to work with while you two are chatting. A list of ponies who may know a bit more about what's going on, if you catch my meaning.
With no resistance from Rainbow Dash, Twilight's concern came back into play, and her eyes moved to Spike. The long dragon was sitting patiently where Twilight had left him, clearly distressed about everything, but holding his tongue all the same. There were pros and cons to leaving him with Rainbow Dash, or insisting that Starlight allow him to tag along. The little guy had already been through too much today, let alone the past week, and it wasn't fair of Twilight to keep piling things on top of him. But at the same time, she didn't want to leave him behind while she went off to go get her answers, especially if Starlight couldn't be trusted. Twilight sighed. She just couldn't decide. So she would let Spike make the call.
Spike, are you going to be okay if I go? I don't think bringing me along would be a good idea,
he meekly replied, seemingly surprised that he was even being asked to weigh in. It was clear that he was way in over his head, and he knew it.
She might try something. Better safe than sorry, right?
A good point if ever there was one. Starlight was still an enigma after all. A few kind acts didn't absolve her of suspicion. It was entirely possible that this was all some sort of elaborate trap, even if Nox's outburst last night served as evidence to the contrary. Spike was clearly uncomfortable around her. It was plain enough in his face, doubly so with how his eyes kept drifting over to her before snapping back to Twilight. Seeing this, she couldn't blame him for wanting to stay behind. A sentiment then encouraged her to ask Rainbow to keep an eye on him for a while, or at least take him to Fluttershy. Rainbow agreed to the terms with no fuss. All of that said and done, Twilight turned to face Starlight yet again, and her still offered hoof. With a deep breath, Twilight placed her hoof on Starlight's, and the familiar sensation and sounds of teleportation overtook Twilight's senses, and the blue light of Starlight's magic became all that she could see.